Good morning, everybody. What I'm going to do here for the students in my Year 13 history class is take you through my own detailed mark scheme for this particular question that you're looking at here. It's a Section A question. This is the one that you attempted, you wrote in class-based conditions way back in October. Again, my apologies for taking so long to getting this feedback to you. Just a reminder that the feedback is in stages. A couple of weeks ago, I gave you your individual mark and attached and a scan of your marked essay. So you've got your written feedback and also the mark scheme. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at that now. The purpose of this video is to walk and talk you through my own detailed plan. Okay, and I've attached that to Teams. So before you play the video, I would strongly recommend that you print that off and have a paper copy in front of you. And that whilst you play the video, obviously pause and read the detailed plan as we go through. Okay, I'm not going to. The purpose of this is not to read through the detailed plan with you, so you can pause the video and do the reading as you go through. And then the final stage, of course, as always, is you go to your Word document, your self-evaluation document, which you've been maintaining for the past year or so, for each essay that I've marked, and that you update it. Okay, and just a reminder that the purpose of that self-evaluation document is for you. It's your own record after each essay of what you realise you need to do to improve. Okay, so that's a really important stage of that, and then upload and return that to me by the deadline. I'll post the message on Teams for that. But again, I really want to emphasise that the self-evaluation document is for you rather than for me. Okay, but it is important that I know that you're completing that. Okay, so let's push on. So there's the question. It's, as I say, a Section A question from a live paper. I forget which year it was. I think it might have been 2019, I'm not sure. Assess the value of the source for revealing the perceived threat of the essay and the nature of Hitler's response to it. And you're asked to explain your answer. And again, you've got those three key components that are built into the mark scheme. A, using the source. B, using the information given about its origin. And thirdly, using your own knowledge about the historical context. And that's really important. We'll come back to that in a minute. There are three things you have to be seen to be doing when you write your answer, and the whole mark scheme revolves around that. So here is the source. Okay, now I'll come on to how to use the time a little bit later on. It's one of the feedback points as I go through this. But the first thing is you do need to spend longer on this question in the exam. You've got Section A, which is this question, then you've got Section B, which is the depth study, and Section C, which is the breadth study. And strictly speaking, you should divide the time evenly. 45 minutes on each of those three questions, because each question has 20 marks. However, clearly you do need to spend a little bit longer on Section A because you need to allow yourself time to read the source, and you really need to be spending 6 or 7 minutes properly planning an answer. Okay, and the plan, in the sense, will be in your head, but what you must be doing in the exam room is you've got to have a pen in your hand, and you need to be annotating. You need to be thinking about the 2 lines of inquiry, and you need to be annotating. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly sort of demonstrate here for you live in a sense of what you should be doing in the exam. So the first thing, remember, is the question very clearly says that you should address the 2 lines of inquiry in 3 ways. And the first of those 3 ways is using the information given to you about the origin of the source. Now, the information given to you about the origin of the source, remember, is this bit here that I'm just drawing a box around. So you really need to be thinking about that, because your first proper building block of your answer is going to be about what we call the provenance. The provenance is the information about the origin of the source. So first thing is, remember, you need to be thinking about what is the nature of the source. Now, the nature of the source, there's our nature, it is a speech. Okay, and clearly, and it's linked to that, to the Reichstag. Okay, and the Reichstag is the audience. And those two things between you, you combine those two things. It's a speech to the Reichstag, a public audience, and that in itself gives you information. Okay, but what you have got to be doing, this is so important with the Section A question. You can't attempt a Section A question unless you have got fingertip knowledge of history in your head about this topic. Okay, so you've got to have the detailed knowledge inside your head. The historical information has got to be there in your memory, because at every stage you're taking the information, the provenance, the source itself, and you're interpreting it, you're evaluating the information, you're analysing the information in the context of what you already know historically. And too often candidates will approach the Section A question the wrong way around. They'll think, oh, it's a source question, I don't really need to have historical knowledge. Cannot emphasise strongly enough that you, at every step in your answer to the Section A question, you've got to be applying what you already know to help you interpret and evaluate and analyse the information in the source. Okay, so straight away you should be thinking, the Reichstag. Okay, that's my audience. He was speaking to the Reichstag. What do you know about the Reichstag? Well, you know that the Reichstag, a year earlier, or a year and 15 months earlier, on the 23rd of March 1933, the Reichstag was effectively coordinated by the Enabling Act. Okay, so I would be straight away saying, well, that's a clue about the audience. I'll just put EA, the Enabling Act of the 23rd of March 1933. There's the precise additional knowledge. So what do you know about the Reichstag? Well, you know that basically it had been turned into a rubber stamp organisation. You know that Hitler didn't need to do any convincing to the Reichstag because it had effectively been brought under Nazi control. It was no longer necessary for the passing of legislation. So why is Hitler making speeches to the Reichstag? Well, the reason Hitler made speeches to the Reichstag, and he carried on doing it, he didn't need to, in a sense. I mean, it had no task, no role left, but Hitler continued to allow it to meet, even though it was even though it was effectively just an organisation for one political party. And after the June 1933, Hitler turned Germany into a one-party state, so the Reichstag was no longer a pluralist parliament. It was just simply a room full of Nazi party members. So the real reason Hitler made speeches was that they were public occasions that would be reported in the press in Germany, and particularly foreign opinion, to get key messages out to the rest of the world. So there, the nature and the audience combines, all those things combine to what it's all about, the purpose. Okay, so I haven't got the space to write there, but the purpose, that you cannot understand the purpose of the speech unless you have that historical knowledge. So you look at the provenance and apply your knowledge, and you come up with the key points. The other thing you've got to really look at when it comes to the provenance is the date, 13th of July 1934. Now, clearly you're told here that it was that 2 weeks earlier, exactly 2 weeks earlier, there'd been the Night of the Long Knives. Okay, so you're using your historical knowledge to place the source into its precise additional context. Why did Hitler wait 2 weeks to give his speech? Well, that clearly gives you clues about the fact that he wanted to retrospectively justify the actions he had taken on the Night of the Long Knives. He's justifying it to the world, to the German press. Clearly that therefore raises question again about purpose. It raises the question about bias. Is he painting a particular picture? What is he trying to achieve by retrospectively 2 weeks later justifying the actions that he took? I mean, that's what he's basically trying to do. The other thing I think is really important looking at the date is actually what then happened immediately afterwards. And I would say the 2nd of August 34, was the death of President Hindenburg. So this particular source was written at a time, or the speech was given at a time when clearly Hitler knew Hindenburg was dying. So he would have given that speech with that knowledge in mind. What was he hoping to achieve? And clearly, again, you'd apply your own knowledge, and you should know that one of the reasons Hitler delivered this speech was, again, his audience. Yeah, it's part of the point of this is the conservative elites in particular. Hitler knew that when Hindenburg died, the position of the presidency, the president of Germany, would become open. And what Hitler, the last thing he wants is to have to go to another presidential election. What he wants is basically a shoe-in where the army will say, we like Hitler, let's offer him the presidency without having to go to a presidential election. And so, again, using your knowledge, you know that the reason for the Night of the Long Knives was to convince the army that Hitler had restored law and order, and he'd restored normality to Germany after a year of relative chaos and political violence on the streets. That the Night of the Long Knives was drawing a line. It was ending the revolution. It was sending a message out that power is returning to the existing structures, the state, the army, and that with that in mind, Hitler's thinking Hindenburg will die any day now. And if I can get this message across convincingly when Hindenburg does die, then the army will offer me the presidency without there having to be a presidential election, which is what the Weimar Constitution said should happen when the president died. So there's lots and lots of kind of like information sitting there beneath the provenance. That's all really the point I want to make. Now, in an exam room, because you've spent weeks, months revising, 2 years internalizing, understanding the historical content, you would hopefully look at that and instantly all those points would come into your head. Okay, and that's really what it's about. Okay, instantly, but you can't do any of that unless you've got the historical knowledge. Now, the next thing you do is obviously you've got to look at the source itself, and again, remember you've got 2 lines of inquiry. Now, what I would say you do is have 2 different colour pens, and just quickly spend no more than 5 minutes in the exam room and read the source twice, and the first time with the first line of inquiry in mind, and the second time with the second line of inquiry in mind, and basically make annotations in the relevant colour so you get a clear sense of it. Now, the first line of inquiry is, how valuable is the source for revealing the perceived threat of the essay? Okay, and you want to look for different points. So I'm going to use blue for this, okay, the perceived threat of the essay. So straight away, one of the reasons the essay were apparently a threat was because they threatened, or they wanted to create, a permanent state of revolution in Germany. Reading on a little bit further, it talks about the intention of gaining control over our armed forces, which is clearly a threat to the state, because what the source is saying is that there should only be one bearer of arms in the state, and that is the German army. So I would say straight away from all of that, you've got a political threat. Okay, political. That's one thing. Remember, so what you've got to do is you've got to sort of like draw inferences. Okay, so that's one. Okay. Still on the first line of inquiry. He then talks about the essay were apparently a threat because they wanted to pursue communist policies and shatter the economic system, which would bring poverty and ruin to all of our people. So I'd say there's a second one there, and I would say that's economic. Okay, that they were an economic threat. Okay, so that's remember the line of inquiry is why were the essay a threat? You then read on, and I would probably pick up a different one here. It says during May it became obvious that the essay had ambitious plans. Just moving down a little bit. There we go. During May, it became obvious the essay had ambitious plans. which had they become a reality, would have resulted in violent disruption. And then talks about breaking every law of decency in their personal conduct. And I would say that is another. They were also a threat. What word would I use for that? I would say they were a moral threat. Okay. Sorry, it's difficult to handwrite using the pen I've got, but hopefully you can just understand what you'd be doing in the exam room. You'd have a pen, you'd be annotating in this particular way. So you've got already 3 different points that kind of answer that first line of inquiry, which is why were they a threat? You've got a political reason, an economic reason, you've got a moral reason. Any other ones? I would say yes. Up here, it talks about them establishing contact with General Schleicher. And then further down, it talks about evidence of plots. Now, those 2 things are linked. Okay, because again, what you should be trying to do is make connections. And I would say there's a 4th reason there why they were apparently a threat, and that's that they were, I'll just put CONSP, conspirators. They were being conspiratorial. They were being plotters. Okay, so that's enough. I've got 4 different reasons from the source that answer the first line of inquiry about why they were a perceived threat, the SA. Now, the second line of inquiry is, what was the nature of Hitler's response to that threat? So I'll just change the colour of my pen, which is what you do in the exam room. So how did Hitler respond? And again, I want to look for ideally 2 or 3 or 4 even different points that answer that question. What was the nature of Hitler's response? Well, straight away you can sort of see here in this paragraph, it says, I had a number of serious talks with Rome. So I'll just write down conversation, CONV, talks, whatever you want to call it. There's the first point. So that was from the beginning, April onwards. So in other words, over a fairly long period of time, Hitler decided to address it by having conversations. But then, when it became obvious that the SA had ambitious plans, he resolved that lightning action was essential. So number 2, violence. He resolved on a violent course, which of course permeated and became the Night of the Long Knives of the 30th of June 1934. So you've got at least 2 different points. Let's just pull back a little bit. Anything else in terms of Hitler's response? I would say that there is. He talks about I was responsible. Okay, this final paragraph here. He takes personal responsibility. I was responsible for burning out the poison. So again, I would actually, it's almost that sort of like we talked about here, didn't we, the moral issue. I would say there's a 3rd point to make, is that Hitler claimed for himself to be the moral judge of the country about what is right or wrong. That's part of his response. And maybe linked to that, possibly a 4th point, he basically says about this wasn't a task for the courts. I was responsible for the fate of the German nation. So Hitler himself, I would say, is identifying with a higher law, that he himself stood above normal law, and only he can determine what was right for the fate of the German nation. So again, what we've pulled out there is 4 points for each of those 2 lines of inquiry. Okay, so hopefully in the exam, I mean, that would have taken you about 6 or 7 minutes, that whole process, okay? About the same amount of time I just spent on it there with you. But that's what, in a sense, it would look like. That's your plan for Section A. You've brainstormed, you've got lots of points written down. Now you sit down and you start writing the answer, okay? So, remember, okay, well, actually, no, let's just talk about the mark scheme first, and then we'll talk about the actual structure of your answer. Remember what I said, the question very clearly says that you should, it gives you the 2 lines of inquiries, and then it says, and it's always the same question, it says explain your answer using the source, using the information given about the source's origin, and your own knowledge about the historical context. That's what it says in the question. And you look at the mark scheme, and the mark scheme is what you're looking at here. And the mark scheme, I mean, I've kind of like structured it to make it clear, but the mark scheme does exactly that. It gives you those three strands, and then it gives you levels, okay? And you can achieve level 1, which is basically a grade U, up to a level 5, which is basically a low A star to a high a low A star to a high A star. And in between, you've got levels 2, 3, and 4. And the wording of the mark scheme is exactly what you're looking at here, okay, for each of those three things. And what you really want to be doing is you want to be achieving the descriptors for level 5 for each of those three tasks that you've been set: to use the source, to use the information given about the source's origin, and to use your own knowledge about the historical context. Now, when I marked your essay, I've given you an indication of where in the mark scheme you got for each of those three strands. Did you get level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? But also whether you were low or middle or high in that particular level. Okay. Now, see the highlighted bits? The highlighted bits tell you that's the new thing you need to do. So, for example, here, level 3 for using the source, the highlighted bits there, that's the new things you need to do that will improve upon a level 2 answer. Okay, and the highlighted bits for level 4, they're the new things that you need to do to improve on a level 3 answer. So what in effect I've done for you here by representing it this way is I've given you like the stepping stones for progression. So whatever you happen to achieve, let's say for example, I said for the middle strand, how well you used your precise additional knowledge. Let's say I gave you a high level, level 2. Okay, so there. So what you need to be doing is you need to be looking at level 3 and thinking, well, what I need to do is I need to basically do that. Or let's say for this strand, using the information about the source's origin, I gave you a middle level 3, well, you need then to be looking at the descriptor for level 4 and looking at the bits in yellow in particular and thinking, right, what's the additional thing that I need to be doing? Okay, so I'm not going to take you through that mark scheme. That's for you to pause the video or to go to your printer and spend time looking at it. Okay, that's all you can. That's all I say you need to do. But it is really important because it's the stepping stones for progression. So you need to be looking carefully at what grade you got, what level you got for each of those three skills, and thinking, right, well, what's my next step to get a higher mark for each of those three skills? And the final overall grade that you get is an amalgamation of those three things. You've got to basically be achieving all three things. It's a combination of the levels for all three that create your overall level. So you can't be really good on one and really weak on the other two and expect to get a high mark. You've got to basically sustain the same level across all three to achieve that particular level. That's really important. So spend time looking at that and reading it and interpreting it and understanding it, okay? In terms of the actual planning and writing of your answer then, the structure, we did a whole lesson way back in year 12 about how to structure and how to analyse. And we started off with this, okay, so hopefully you'll recognise this. I've taken the question and I've used colours to basically say there are in effect 6 main elements to the answer. There are the 2 lines of inquiry, there and there. So the first line of inquiry, how the threat of the essay was perceived, and the second line of inquiry, the nature of Hitler's opposition to the perceived threat of the essay. And you're asked to do 3 things, okay? You're asked to explain your answer using the provenance of the source, you're asked to make evidenced inferences from the source, and you're asked to explain your answer using precise additional knowledge. Now that one there, the precise additional knowledge, that is something unlike the other two. You don't just do that in one paragraph. That has got to be permeating all the way through your answer. Okay, the precise additional knowledge. Every paragraph of your answer has got to have precise additional knowledge. The other building blocks, okay, are slightly different in the sense you can almost focus a paragraph on each of those separate areas. Okay, so the structure is as follows. Okay, so you would write an introduction, and at the end you'd write a conclusion. Park that information to one side just for the moment. But in the middle part of your essay, you've got basically 4 building blocks. Okay, and the first building block is, I'll just write 1, is where you focus in on the provenance of the source. The second building block is you make inferences about the first line of inquiry, and the third building block you make inferences about the second line of inquiry. So that's the inferences here, and you're doing it for that line of inquiry and that line of inquiry. And then the fourth building block, in a sense, you pull back and you consider the comprehensiveness of the scope of the source, which in a sense is going back to provenance again. Okay, and looking at provenance in a slightly different way. So what that basically means is that the way you structure your answer, it forces you to address the provenance, it forces you to make inferences here and here, and the additional knowledge must be present in all of those building blocks. Okay, and it's important that you have a highly structured approach to writing your answer, so that you're helping yourself by showing the examiner that you're doing these things. Okay, so the rest of the plan then, just move down, gives you the sort of information. Now this is the bit really where you probably want to pause the video and just read this, and then play the video while I just sort of highlight some of the key points. So that first building block of your answer, okay, is all about the provenance. It's the bit where you're asked to consider the 2 lines of inquiry by focusing in on the nature of the source, the information given about the origin of the source. Now, what I've done here, as you can see, and this is where you can definitely kind of help yourself by memorizing and learning certain keywords and applying them to the source. But always consider the date of the source, okay? Because what the examiner is looking for you to do is to take the context of the source, the date it was written, and apply your precise additional knowledge. In other words, what do you know was happening at that particular time that will help you interpret the source? So you're told that it was the 13th of July 1934. So straight away you will immediately latch onto the fact that it's 2 weeks after the Night of the Long Knives. Now you're told that in the provenance anyway, but it was 2 weeks before the death of Hindenburg, 2nd of August 1934. Okay, so immediately by looking at the date, you've got a sense of what was happening at that time, which helps you start to form a picture in your mind. You're making these connections in your mind about the purpose of the source. Okay, the second thing to always think about is what was the nature of the source. Now, as we said, it was a speech. Okay, and any speech is of course designed to influence people to believe the views of the speaker, and this is a speech by Hitler. So obviously the purpose of a speech is to persuade, and so there it is going to be likely to be very consciously biased. That's the purpose of speeches. It is to persuade people to believe what you believe. Okay, so that's an important thing. Another thing you should always think about when you consider provenance is the tone. Okay, now again, you take your knowledge. You know that in this speech Hitler is reasserting his authority. Okay, we know that, I mean, again, because you've got the information in your head, you've done the revision, you've got the fingertip knowledge, you would hopefully immediately latch on to the fact that a month earlier Von Papen had given a speech at the University of Marburg claiming Hitler was losing control over his own movement, that the SA were being too influential, the revolution was going on too long, etc. So applying that own knowledge, you immediately get a sense of what the tone is. Hitler is trying to retrospectively, in other words, after the event, justify the actions he took on the night of the Long Knives. Obviously, he wants to create an impression to the Conservatives that actually what he did was not uncontrolled violence. It was in fact completely the opposite. It was about actually using violence to restore order, which is what the Conservatives wanted. So the tone is very much that Hitler is trying to project in the speech is very much about restoring order. I am restoring order. I am bringing to a halt the threat of a second revolution, that the SA wanted to take over the army and sort of like extend the revolution to overthrow the state. And Hitler saying, no, I brought to a halt that. I used violence, yes, but it was a necessary violence to bring about peace. Okay, so there's the tone. You've also got to consider the audience. So again, immediately, Hitler was speaking to the Reichstag. But again, you've got to kind of like, you're an A-level historian. By this point, you would take your own knowledge. As I said earlier, you knew that 15 months earlier, the Enabling Act had basically turned the Reichstag into simply a rubber stamp, because it no longer had the power to legislate, to approve laws. Germany was now a one-party state, so the Reichstag no longer consisted of multiple political parties. It only consisted of one political party, the Nazis. So theoretically, why did Hitler even bother speaking to the Reichstag? It was just simply a bunch of yes men who were going to nod and agree to everything he says. It had no legal authority, no right to approve anything. Hitler made the laws by himself. But Hitler retained the Reichstag because it was a forum for making public announcements. And it was a key moment when Hitler spoke to the Reichstag, because the world's press and the German press would report what Hitler said. So the purpose of speaking to the Reichstag was very much with a mind to influencing domestic and international opinion about what Hitler wanted Germans and the rest of the world to think about Nazi Germany. So having considered the date, the nature, the tone, the audience, you then are really getting to the crux of it. What's the purpose of the speech? So I've pointed out that I think the speech had a threefold purpose. First of all, to retrospectively justify his legal actions on the night of the Long Knives to the German middle classes, okay, largely because the middle classes want law and order, because law and order is good for business. The middle classes are the business people. They run the German businesses, the German business community. They're very anxious about the SA being a quite socialist organisation wanting to take over private enterprise, etc. So it's a very clear message to the German middle classes. Don't worry, by crushing the SA, I am ensuring that private enterprise continues to stay in your hands. Secondly, it's a message to his conservative political backers, the von Papens, etc., of the world, the army leaders, that they will be protected, that they will be part of Germany's future. Okay, and thirdly, it's a message to international opinion, because of course Hitler at this stage has a very small army, 100,000 men. Hitler wants to start revising the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and he knows he can only do that if the British, the French and the Americans are convinced that he is peaceful in his intentions. So it's all about revisionism. It's all about preventing affront to the rest of the world, that this new strong dictatorial leader of Germany has peaceful intentions. And so if he does start arguing that I want to have a bigger army, it's not for aggressive reasons, it's simply because it's a fair and just request, etc., etc. So that's really what the speech is all about. There's our speech, there's our provenance. Okay, so lots you can talk about in that particular part of the answer. Okay, but so I would pick those words in bold at the beginning of each of those bullet points, just to sort of like, what if you memorize those words, the date, the nature, the tone, the audience and the purpose, then it should get little sparks sort of like in your mind that will get you thinking, and then that will give you the material you need to write a decent paragraph the about the provenance of the source. Okay. Next building block is the next two building blocks are where you focus on that part of the question that says answer the question using the source. Okay. And because there are two lines of inquiry, you're going to write two building blocks. The first building block will be on the first line of inquiry, which is the perceived threat of the essay. So this is where you've already done the work because you looked at the source. Remember, we did it in different colours. So this first one actually we did in blue, so I'll just change back to blue. Okay, so the perceived threat of the essay in blue. Remember what we did? We identified four. I think we identified 4 points, but I've actually sort of broken them down into 5. And there are our inferences. Okay, the essay were perceived as pushing for a permanent state of revolution, which created instability and uncertainty. The second inference was about the essay threatened economic recovery because they were perceived as being even potentially communist, which would upset the middle classes. Thirdly, the essay were perceived as the threat because they threatened to take over the state, and that made the conservative elites very anxious. Fourthly, the essay were perceived as a threat because they were morally dubious. Okay. Fourthly, and then finally, they were perceived as a threat because they were plotters, they were conspiratorial. Okay. Now that column there is what we call the inference, and each of those inferences is backed up by a piece of evidence, and the evidence is in the middle column in my plan. And as you can see, the evidence is little quotes. Okay, you pick on a line, you find that bit of evidence, and what you're doing with the inference is you're saying the same thing, but you're putting it in your own words by applying a bit of additional knowledge to it, and that's really, really important. And that's why I've got a third column there, which is saying, look, how can you develop that evidence? You've got to make that inference. You've got to, when you're making the point, the weak candidates will simply parrot off column 2. They'll parrot off what the wording from the source. Okay. Yes, you need to pick on the evidence, but you've got to basically expand and develop what the evidence is saying, and that's what an inference is. Okay, it's adding more to it using your own knowledge. Okay, and that's why I've given clues here as to the bits of additional knowledge that you could use to develop the evidence, which in turn makes your inference. Okay, so again, spend some time reading that through just to get some sort of sense of how that is done. Then, just moving down, I'll change it to a different colour. The second line of inquiry, exactly the same. So remember, when we actually looked at the source a few minutes ago, I used a different colour for that. So I'll just switch to red for this. And the second line of inquiry is, what can you learn from the source about the nature of Hitler's response? And remember, we identified that, first of all, he was slow to react. He spent a lot of time talking. Okay, there is the evidence that relates to the inference, and there's the precise additional knowledge that you could apply to expand on the evidence to make the inference. And then the second inference was that Hitler then made a decision to act swiftly. So again, when you make that point, you've got to be careful. Don't use quote the evidence, yes, which is there, but you've got to put it into your own words. So reference the evidence, put a little quote in, put it in your own words, and try to add a little bit to it using some additional precise knowledge to show you know something about it. We then said, remember, that another aspect of Hitler's response was he identified himself as the voice of the German nation, a higher form of law. So again, there is our quote that leads to the inference, and there's the additional knowledge that you could bring in to show you know something about it. And then the final one, Hitler justified his response in moral terms. Again, there are the quotes that you can develop to make the inference, and there's some additional knowledge that you could bring in to develop that point. Okay, so there's your second and third building blocks, and then your fourth and final building block before you write your conclusion is to go back to that provenance and to ask that question, okay, is the source enough by itself to answer the question that I've been given? Or is it too narrow? Okay. Now, in a sense, what you need to do in this part of your answer is you need to say, yeah, it has got breadth, it has got plenty of scope, but it's not quite enough. Okay, there's something missing for some reason or another. Okay, that's not mentioned in the source that I think helps answer the question, and then you've got to explain why was that missing. Okay, so again, you can pause and just read what I've put there, but I basically said overall the source has got breadth. Okay, now a useful tip with this, it has got breadth because it covers a wide range of points. So remember we said it does cover political points, it covers economic points, it covers moral points, it covers international, it also covers domestic inside Germany. It also covers long term and it covers immediate. Okay, so that gives it balance, it gives it range. It does cover a wide range of different points that answer the question. However, there is a limitation to it. It does exaggerate a number of points. Okay, which hopefully again you've already sort of like picked up in the earlier paragraph about provenance. Again, using your own knowledge. So, for example, Hitler described the SA as being communists. Now, we know that they weren't communists. We know that the SA hated communists, okay? Why did they hate communists? Because communists were international, okay? True communism is an international Marxist ideology. The SA were not international Marxists. They were socialists, though. They did strongly believe that wealth should be shared more evenly, taken from the well-off and redistributed amongst the poorer Germans. Okay, but Hitler, of course, exaggerates it in his speech for effect. He describes the SA as sort of like being communist in their intentions. So therefore, the speech is not entirely accurate. It is biased. Why is it biased? Why does Hitler exaggerate? Because he wants to win the support of the middle classes, because the speech is directed at the middle classes and the conservative elites, reassuring them that by murdering the SA he was working for the interests of the well-off. Okay, so that's sort of like what you're doing in this particular paragraph. Arguably also the source lacks some breadth because you could argue that it focuses mainly on Hitler's immediate objectives, is focused on the here and now. Now we as historians know that in the long term eventually Hitler had no intention of retaining his alliance with the army and with the state and with the businessmen and etc. That in the long run Hitler wanted eventually to take over the state of empowering the SS to run Germany. We know that in the long term, I mean, Hitler in this speech is very much sort of like suggesting that he is a moderate, that he's not a radical, that he is a revisionist, that he is a peaceful leader, etc. Just intent on restoring law and order. We know that actually 4 or 5 years down the line, Hitler will get rid of the lamb's clothing and display the true aggressive leader beneath who wanted to expand Germany's attentions. It wasn't about revisionism, it was about aggressive expansion. It wasn't about allowing the middle classes to run Germany. In the end, ultimately, Hitler wanted the SS to run Germany and so on and so forth. So you can argue that in terms of scope, certain aspects of it are Hitler deliberately does not mention. He keeps things concealed for the moment, so it doesn't have the full scope that perhaps a historian would want. Okay, so it's just getting you to think the way historians would think. Okay, so that's that. So finally, just a few additional points, okay, for you to consider. So we haven't spoken about the introduction. Okay, I've spoken about the 4 building blocks that make up the main part of the essay, but remember there is the before you've got your 4 building blocks, but before that you've got to write an introduction. At the end of the building blocks you've got to write a conclusion. Okay, so with regards your introduction, try to focus more on the nature of the historian's craft. Okay, for example, the historian's task is to evaluate the piece of primary evidence, to treat it cautiously by considering its nature and purpose in order to understand its limitations. Some aspects may lack credibility, with statements that are unsupported opinion and bias. And from this, to understand its positive value, the valuable historical information it gives to the historian once the limitations are understood, etc. Because remember, this is not a section B or section C essay question. It is a section A question, which is about evaluating a source. So ultimately, sitting beneath this question, it's the examiner wants to get a sense of, do you understand what the job of a historian is? Okay, so yes, within the introduction you do need to show some knowledge about the essay and the Night of the Long Knives, but also within your introduction show understanding about what the task of the historian is, because you're being asked to be a historian in the next 45 minutes when you write your answer. You're being asked to don't just believe a source, you've got to basically unpick it, work out which bits you can't trust, which bits you can trust, and why. Okay, so you need to try and get that across in your introduction. And it's a very straightforward introduction to write. You almost would write the same introduction, whatever the question is. And I would say try to sort of like bring in those sort of buzzwords, the nature, the purpose, they're key words. I always like that word credibility, because you're looking at the nature of sources, evidence. Okay, which bits of the source can be used as evidence for what? Show awareness of the fact that your job is to look for opinion and bias. Identify that there may be opinion and bias, which is useful, even though it may be wrong, it may be false, even though the source may be exaggerated and may be untruthful. Nevertheless, in spite of that, we as historians want to know what perceptions are. Okay, that's still useful information to us. Okay, we've already established, for example, that Hitler claimed in the source that the SA were communists. That's not true, but it's still useful information for us because it tells us that Hitler wanted people to believe the SA were communists. That's relevant historical information. So what it's all moving towards, I've given an example of that there, is its positive value. Positive value means, in spite of its limitations, in spite of the fact it may not be telling the truth, what is the value? Yeah, and the value, there could be a lot of value in it because it helps us understand Hitler's mindset, his motives, the fact that he was distorting the truth, for what purpose, and what was the intended impact. Okay, so those are the sort of key words. I think if you can sort of like say to yourself, try to use the word nature, try to use the word purpose. I haven't put it in there, but I'd also try to use the word audience, try to use the word opinion, try to use the word bias, try to use the word limitations, try to use the phrase positive value. They're all useful buzzwords to put in your introduction. When it comes to writing, next bullet point, when it comes to writing a conclusion, focus your conclusion by summarising on that thing about the positive value. Use that phrase positive value. Positive value means, remember, there are limitations, there are weaknesses, but knowing those limitations, knowing the weaknesses, is actually a strength. A good historian will turn the limitation into a point of value. And so pull those together, okay? What is the overall positive value? Try to identify any linking threads. Is there anything overall? Overall, this is a really useful source because it helps me as a historian understand the following, okay? And I would say, for me, it helps me understand Hitler's short-term concerns and objectives in the summer of 1934 in the context of retaining the support of the conservatives and the middle classes. He's not yet ready to move on to his long-term revision, his long-term expansionist objectives. he's calling a halt to the second revolution. That's what makes it particularly useful. Okay, it helps us identify Hitler's concerns and fears and objectives at that juncture in time. Less valuable for understanding Hitler's longer term objectives. Third bullet point, just a matter of spelling. Bias or biased. Notice the spelling of those two words. Next one, timing. Okay, so timing is crucial. Remember, you've got 2 hours 15 minutes for the exam. That's 135 minutes. But as I said at the beginning, even though you do 3 questions and each question carries 20 marks, theoretically, therefore, you spend 45 minutes on each of the 3 questions. But however, you can't really do that because you've got to build in a little bit of extra time for the source question so you can read the source, which means you've got to spend a little bit less time on the section B and section C essay questions. So my recommendation is that you spend 42 minutes on the section B, that's the depth study, and the section C, the breadth study essay questions, which makes 84 minutes in total. That gives you 51 minutes for the section A, slightly longer. And I would say of that 51 minutes, spend about 7 minutes reading and annotating the source, the bit I did earlier. Okay, so 51 minutes, take off 7, that then gives you 44 minutes to write your actual answer. And then when it comes to using that 44 minutes, you've got to be really, really well disciplined. And that's why I've said use the 6-paragraph structure, okay, that I've taught you to use. So in other words, your first paragraph is your introduction, 4 minutes on that. Your second paragraph is the paragraph about the provenance. I said 8 minutes on that. Your third paragraph is your evidenced inferences for the first line of inquiry. I've said 9 minutes on that because you need longer on that one, don't you? It's quite a lot to get through. Okay, and then your fourth paragraph is that building block where you again make evidence inferences, but this time for the second line of inquiry, likewise 9 minutes. And then your fifth paragraph is the paragraph about scope, comprehensiveness, breadth. I've said again quite a lot to say there, 8 minutes. And then your sixth paragraph is your conclusion, about 6 minutes. So you add all those minutes up, that adds up to 44, plus 7 minutes planning, there's your 51 minutes. So what we're saying is you've got to be very, very focused and disciplined when you write your section A answer. Really, really focused. You can't go over the 51 minutes because you then need to go into section B, which is 44 minutes, and then, 42 minutes, and then section C, which is 42 minutes. So you've got to be really, really smart in your use of time. A couple of other points on that in terms of using the time. Have a wristwatch. Okay, remember that's so important. Take it off, put it on the desk in front of you. You don't want to be constantly looking up at the clock on the wall in the exam room. That's just because when you look up, your hand stops moving. You don't write. You've got to kind of like master that technique of writing and keeping an eye on the time, and therefore to have a watch on the desk in front of you is really, really important. Secondly, I would say, again, everybody writes at different speed. Now, if you look back at the previous 2 or 3 pages of this plan, some of you may be thinking, there's no way I can get all of that down in 51 minutes or 44 minutes of writing. I just simply couldn't do that. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. I've written lots of ideas down because I want to sort of max you out, that those who can write fast can get as much down as possible. But you don't need to write all of those points. Okay, the important thing is that you write some of those points and you write some of them well to hit the mark scheme. So don't punish yourself if you haven't got time to make every single one of those inferences and include all those little quotes and include all that information, additional knowledge, etc., etc. You've only got 9 minutes on that particular paragraph. The important thing is to do the best you can within that 9 minutes and then move on to the next paragraph and do the best you can, etc., etc. Hopefully you see what I mean by that. The important thing is that you cover the 6 paragraphs in the time that you've got, and that you do each paragraph as well as you can and then you move on to the next paragraph. But you must cover all 6 paragraphs in the time that you've actually got. So it's very, very smart use of the time you have. And the only way you can really do this is to practice. Over the next few months, you've got lots of these questions in your booklet of 106 essay questions. In the revision guidebook, in the textbook, you've got all of these questions that you can practice and practice and practice. And that's the only way you can actually do this. But the timing is absolutely crucial. Okay, and if you memorize the plan, if you memorize the structure, which I've identified here, and just work to that sort of memorized template and stick to the timing, you almost certainly will write a pretty decent answer to section A. Other ones I put really, really important in the paragraph about provenance is to avoid these simplistic assertions, the type of things that years 7, 8 and 9, when you're in Key Stage 3, would tend to say. Really quite naive comments like, oh, it's a speech and therefore it must be factual, it must be honest, or the source is useful because it's detailed. Which is all nonsense, really, if you think about it. The other classic one, oh, the source is from the time, which makes it really reliable. No, okay. It makes it useful, but it doesn't make it reliable. Remember, they're different words. Reliable is about honesty. Okay, sources from the time are just as likely to be, in fact, are more likely to be dishonest than sources written later on, etc., etc. So really be careful to avoid simplistic assertions. And I think the key thing is, as long as you're focusing in on nature and purpose, and you're really thinking about what was the motivation of the person writing the source, and you hold true to that, then you will probably avoid writing these simplistic comments that can creep through from weaker candidates. And then to finish off, the final point is the one that I said right at the beginning, that additional knowledge is so, so crucial. If you are of the mindset, oh, section A is the source question and I don't need to worry about additional knowledge, that historical knowledge that I've memorized is that's all going to be in sections B and C, then you are on the path towards a very, very low mark. More than any other skill, section A, you cannot interpret and evaluate a source unless you are doing it within the context of what you know in detail. Okay. If you don't apply knowledge, then your evaluation will be simplistic and hollow. Okay, and it will result in a very, very low mark. So within every single paragraph, you've got to be, it's almost like a little checklist. In every paragraph you write, you have got to, everything you say has got to be in the context of what you know, of your precise additional historical knowledge. And that's, when we say precise additional, we mean, I've given an example there, precise. If you say the speech was made shortly after the Night of the Long Knives, no mark. It tells you that it tells you that in the provenance. If you say the speech was made 14 days, then that's precise. If you say, shortly after the speech, Hindenburg died, that's too general. If you say just over 2 weeks after the speech, on the 2nd of August 1934, Hindenburg died, that's precise additional knowledge. Okay? I've referenced the von Pappen's Marburg speech to the University of Marburg on the 17th of June 1934. Knowing that helps you interpret the source. Okay, you have that knowledge, it helps you understand the purpose of the speech, because the speech was being made directed at people like von Papen to convince von Papen that you don't need to worry about me. So you've got to apply precise additional knowledge at every turn, and you've got to be really, really convincing the examiner that you've got the precise additional knowledge. If you don't put precise additional knowledge into your answer at every possibility, then the examiner is not going to give you a decent mark. Okay, so I really can't emphasize that one strongly enough. That's it. Hopefully that's useful for you. You may want to go back and play the video again. Certainly you need to turn the video off and then just spend an hour or so just reading through the model answer carefully, just thinking about every single point I've made. And as I said at the beginning, once you've done all of that, go back to your self-evaluation document, jot down just 4 or 5 points, okay, onto it for whatever this essay is. I think this is essay 7, is it? I can't remember. whatever it is, just jot down, and you're jotting it down for yourself. You're not doing it for me, you're doing it as an aid memoir. What have I learned from this? What are the main things that I now need to remember? So that in 2 or 3 months' time, when you begin your final revision, the first thing you do is go back to your self-evaluation document and you just remind yourself about what you've learned. Okay, that's it. Hopefully that's useful for you. And I will see you back in class in the new term. Enjoy the rest of your holiday, whatever is left of it. Thank you very much. Bye.